So this poster is one of the ISO posters. It's ISO-IEC who produce one of these posters every year. And this is one particular that I thought was really relevant because each time the text on the poster is a little different. But one standard, one test, accepted everywhere. This is the ideal situation. We're obviously not going to reach it. But if you're in the business of trading, this is what you really want. You want to know that the regulator in the country that you're selling from is going to use the same tests, the same evaluations as the regulators in the country that you're selling to, so that nothing gets stuck, nothing gets caught in trade. So now I want you to imagine you have an incoming shipment that you are responsible for testing grain shipments coming in. And you're going to test that incoming, and let's say it's wheat, shipment for the key quality measures. This could be moisture, protein, ash, falling number perhaps. And these parameters will be outlined in the contract. Now all trade is governed by a contract between the buyer and the seller. And the results that you obtain are different to the results that the seller claimed. Maybe the seller said that the protein level was 14%. You test it and you come up with 12%. So now there's a dispute between the buyer and the seller. If you're the buyer, you're telling the seller that they didn't meet the contract. If you're representing the buyer, they didn't meet the contract. So most countries have a process or a protocol to resolve these type of disputes. So in your protocol, you're required to repeat your analysis. It's a bit hard to go back to the seller because the bulk load is now in your harbor, it's right in your territory. So you're asked to repeat the measurements. And in doing so, you actually get a different number. This time you get 13. So the seller's got 14, you got 12, you got 13. Here we go. We're here, we're here, we're here. Is this 12? Is this 14? Is this 13? This is the correct, or the best to correct, with some variability around it, but which one's right? How are you going to resolve it? So we're going to talk a little bit about this, and at the end I'm going to ask you to answer the questions. Which ones are correct? Are they both? Are they all correct? How can you explain the differences? Can you stand by the results from your laboratory? Why are they different to the results the seller is claiming? And can you explain the cause of the differences? So I'm going to give you a few examples. I'm still going to stick with wheat, just because it's something that I know a little bit about. This is a supply chain. It's an idealized supply chain. We start at the farm. The farmer delivers the wheat to an elevator, usually uses a truck or some other type of transport device. And it might go to a primary elevator. And the primary elevator might hold it for a period of time. Then it might go into a rail car and be sent to a processor. Maybe it goes off to the food company and they make breakfast cereal up there in the top right. Or perhaps it goes into domestic shipping, which is quite common in the United States because it could go down a river in a domestic barge. And then it goes to an export terminal. Now you can turn this supply chain around the other way. You're going to be at the import terminal, and I think I might have been clever. You're at import terminal now, so it's not an export terminal anymore, it's an import terminal. And you've got a food processor, someone who wants to make breakfast cereal or bread or something else, maybe just a miller, someone who wants to make flour. And you have to get the flour from the import terminal to the processor. And as I said, that could be a flour miller. And now we've got another movement, and the miller is particularly keen to have that wheat. He doesn't want you holding the wheat. The wheat that comes to this part of the world comes from a number of different places, and I apologize. I have this map because it's for Southeast Asia, and I went looking to find a similar one for India, and I couldn't find it. But in fact, you are buying wheat from the same type of places, from Canada, from Ukraine, from Russia, from Australia. So the product that's in that shipment is coming from a number of different locations. In fact, and different countries choose to buy from different locations. So someone who's testing wheat here in India might not find the same type of wheat in any given year. And again, you'll be able to see these charts a little more clearly, but these cover the years from 2010 through to 2015. And this particular bar, this left-hand one, is Australia. And the height of the bars indicates how much of the wheat, percentage of their wheat, that Malaysia bought from Australia in any given year. And as we go across, I think it's Canada, even I'm having trouble reading them here. But essentially this is the US, so they might buy from one. And what has happened in the region, and what is going to continue to happen, is a change in the supply profile. Not only is the wheat purchasing going up, in Indonesia it's going up 7% a year as there's acceptance of European-style breads, and the demand for flour and flour products is going up. But what we had was traditional wheat exporters like Canada, Australia, the US, who have very strict grain quality standards. They take a lot of pride in being able to define the wheat, and they usually sell the wheat in single grades or lots, so that you buy wheat from Australia, you'll get a certain grade of wheat. And now what has happened is that they call it the Black Sea wheat. There is wheat coming in from the Ukraine and Russia, which doesn't follow the same standards in terms of cleanliness, or wheat's allowed to have 10% foreign material. So you can have 10% of stones and bugs and chaff and everything else in the wheat load, and that meets the international grain standard. There are standards for most of the grains, the Codex standards, which sort of overarch all other standards. Individual countries can have standards, but the Codex standards, and most of them are very straightforward. They give you a simple, this is how clean it should be, this is the level of identity, it should have this level of protein, or it should have a defined level. But what is coming in from the Black Sea area is not as clean, but it's cheap. And so what is happening is that the buyers, the people in the flour mills and other places that are buying wheat, are prepared to buy the cheaper wheat and then clean it themselves. And might have slightly different performances. I was talking to a flour miller from Sri Lanka who told me that he's worked out that he gets reasonably good performance if he buys Australian wheat, and then he takes 10% of his wheat from the Black Sea area, and he can still run a successful flour mill with that. But that's 10% cheaper. And so to someone that's producing flour, that's a very important factor. So sometimes the quality is not so important to them. This is India, and I may have to read it off here. As I go from the left, the tall yellow one is Australia. So this is the wheat, and these are the years. This is Australia, and also India is now starting to buy. It's these little bumps here. Is starting to buy from the Black Sea area. And this is the wheat that is actually imported by years. You can tell that some years, presumably because there was a good crop in India, or there was no money to buy wheat, then it goes down. But this goes from, that's 2016. It starts back in 1960. So this is things are not always a smooth line. It just depends on the needs and the availability of funds to purchase. And this is a different view, different set of data to that. And I think this is 2015. And this is Australian wheat that's coming in here. And this is France, actually, Argentina. So depending on trade relationships between countries, people tend to buy from different areas. These ones in the middle here, these little bumps that you can hardly see, this is Russia and Ukraine. So some of that Black Sea wheat. So what do we talk about when we talk about flour quality? Well, these are the standard tests that flour mills run. They run protein, ash, falling number, which is a measure of the viscosity of the starch in the grain. And these are important to the buyers. And these are important measures, and they may or may not be included in the contracts. The contracts will say they will have the safety factors in them, and I'll get to that in just a minute. So grain standards are specific to the commodity. The grain standard for wheat is not the same as the grain standard for oats and barley. In fact, Codex is currently working on an international standard for quinoa. Bolivia has asked for there to be a standard developed, and it's going to take a couple of years to get into place. While there might be an overarching standard, the importing country has their own regulations for quality or quarantine, usually very important for quarantine, but may also have regulations around quality. And there will be the relevant food safety laws, which may come from Codex, but they could also be local food safety laws. Between countries, there are different grades and quality levels, and they're usually competitive grades. They're used to get a better price or to sell or to gain a market. There will be restrictions, and there could be issues in any given season, depending on pests and other disease problems, maybe mycotoxins in the crop. There are overriding protocols that can handle this. Usually the Codex Alimentarius is the one, but there's also the Cartagena protocol, which actually helps in the area of not GMOs, but living microorganisms, which is a component of the same. It has an overriding trade requirement, although it's not actually operating. It's almost there. It's got enough countries have signed it that it is about to go up. And then it can also include as to, it could be limited by the amount of the storage system. How much space is there? Is it possible to segregate, or is all of the grain commingled? And then there will also be environmental, land protection and quarantine laws. So just keeping in mind what a standard is, well, it's a published specification. It has a common language. It'll be a technical specification or some other precise criteria, and it's designed to be used consistently as a rule, a guideline, or a definition. And these standards are set by governments usually. They can be national governments or regional governments. They could also be set by intergovernmental agencies or standards development organizations like AACC or AACC. Trade organizations. There's an organization called GAFTA, G-A-F-T-A, which is a grain trading organization, which has a worldwide network of laboratories that are certified to test grain. They usually use the same methods. They might take an AACC method or an AOAC method, but if you're into a dispute, it would be a GAFTA laboratory that would probably be used. And in some cases, particularly in areas where they're new and developing, there might be an industry or a scientific society that produces a new method. And essentially, there are standards organizations all around the world. I think this band I picked, these are the standard organizations in the Caribbean. We were doing a project there, and I just happened to have put them into a banner. So overriding this, the person that's most going to initiate this is the customer. And the customer is going to have a contract. And this is just a a rough example of a contract, but one part of the contract is the quality section. And essentially what this contract says, the quality and condition is to be final at the port of loading in accordance with official inspection certificates. So essentially what this is saying is if that I am shipping out of North America and grain, then when I load the ship, that's the time at which everything is sealed, the certificates are there, and the numbers are produced. They can actually appeal the certificates that are put on at the port of loading if the seller doesn't agree with the official inspection. In the United States, there's actually an opportunity for 2 appeals. You can have a local appeal, and then you can go to a federal appeal. So perhaps for something like mycotoxins, you might, let's just say it's deoxynivalenol in wheat. Maybe the official inspection gives a higher level than will be accepted by the buyer, and you can appeal locally, and the test will be run again locally. Excuse me. And you still don't like the number, you can appeal again because there's a lot of money involved. If it arrives at its destination and the level is still high, or maybe you've got a spot sample, maybe you don't believe that sample represents a lot, they would be reasons to question. So this is now, we're putting it into the ship, this is the port of loading, and that's there. Now the buyers and the sellers understand that there will be errors in the system. No sampling and testing method is absolutely perfect. And so they will negotiate as to what level of risk they are each prepared to take. And in this case, this is actually a sampling plan, in this case, which is going to test 1,000 particles. So that could be 1,000 grains, or if you get down to the laboratory, but normally when it's a grain or corn kernel, these are whole seeds. So it's 1,000 particles. And if they test 1,000 particles, they will get the type of curve there. So up here, what is happening is that we'll accept here, and because the seller is prepared to take some risk, this is the area that might have been good material, but because of this agreed sampling and testing protocol, this part of the curve, the grain in this area, will be rejected, and they'll have to find another market for it. Now on the flip side, the buyer also takes some risk. And this level of agreement is actually an agreement between the buyer and the seller. It's part of the contract. And it's how we get around some of these discussions. This is how, if we get a 14 and say a 12, well, that's within their curve, and they can accept that. But this, again, it's a contract, it's not a regulation, and it's an agreement between the buyer and the seller. So every time we move the grain, every time we transfer it, is an opportunity to take a sample. It's rather hard to take a sample if we're in the elevator. It's so high, it's almost impossible. But when we move it, is an opportunity. So as we need to sample to get a test result, we want to take a representative sample. They're not random samples, they're representative of the load. We know that sampling is usually destructive, so we don't want to take too many samples. If we want to know 100%, we'll have to test the whole load and we'll have nothing left to sell. So we want to take the right number of samples, so it needs to be cost effective. And we need to be sure that it represents the entire lot. And there's never 100% certainty. We know, as I showed in that buyer-seller's curve, that there's always that space at the top and the bottom of the curve. Now, assuming that all of our samples are really particles or individual elements, so whether it's grain or flour or in the case of the deoxynivalenol, it might be molecules in solution. They might be containers, that might be the particle size that you're looking at. A sample is essentially a subset of particles from the bulk. So it's a small subset, and due to random chance, the proportion of the positive particles in the sample may differ from the bulk lot. And it's a little like going to the casino, or just taking a quarter or a coin and flipping it. And you know that if you flip a coin, you've got an option of heads or tails. But is that, and you might expect that, well, if you do it 10 times, you'll get 5 heads and 5 tails. But because of probability, that never happens. In fact, what you tend to get is one time, or the probability is that you might actually get 1 head and 9 tails, so that only some of the lot will actually give you 5 and 5. I did this experiment in Bogota with the government regulatory officials from the Trade and Health Department, and I handed out quarters and asked them to flip them. And one gentleman got 9 heads and 1 tail. So it's very much it's statistics. It's not absolute. You can't guarantee it's going to go that way. But that's the way in which we take samples. That's effectively what we're seeing. The particle will either be positive for the analyte or it will be negative for the analyte. So if we were looking again at the example of mycotoxins, how many in a sample of 100 kernels will be positive? And we're looking at 2 milligrams per kilogram. Well, here's the 100 kernel thing. So only 18% of the time will we actually hit the true value of the lot. If the lot in the bulk is 2 milligrams per kilogram, only 18% of the time will we get that true value. So again, we're seeing this difference. Sampling is going to affect the results that you get. This is the same. Now if we take a larger sample, this time we're going to take 800 particles or kernels, this will actually tighten up that curve, and you will get 48% of the lot will actually, the analyses will actually reflect the true value. So this is where your sampling plan comes into play. You probably would be much happier knowing that you're getting the true value or closer to the value about 50% of the time rather than just 20% of the time. And this is the type of theory that sits behind the sampling plans that have been developed. And I don't pretend to be a statistician, but it's important that we understand that these plans have been carefully things. So, and this is a problem when you've got low levels like mycotoxins, because the some samples will obviously be below and some will be above, and I'm going to skip a couple of these, but except to say that the sample is really driving the results. If you don't have the right sample, it doesn't matter how good your test method is. The sample is going to determine whether you get the right answer. And you can only increase your sample size. I went from 100 to 800. You can only increase it to a reasonable amount. You don't want bags and bags of sample coming into the laboratory. You don't want to have to grind and test all of those samples. So there's only a certain limit that you can increase the sample size to impact it. Now this is just going back to how many times a truck might be tested. So this would be the grain that you'd expect in export. It's actually going to start at the farm over on the right-hand side, and every time it moves across the page, every time, so all of those trucks will be tested. So the number of times it's actually tested before it goes into the bulk load. So when we talk about just taking a sample from the top of a bulk load, we really are taking a sample that represents the whole load, because the rest of the load has been sampled and tested before it actually reaches the final loading. So people talk about, well, we're only taking the top, you're just taking some buckets from the top of the load. But in fact, those are representative because all of the quality traits and things that have been tested along the way. And I just threw in a couple of pictures to give you an idea as to how these trucks are probed. This is a truck over here on the left that's being picked up to an elevator. And this is the probe that's going into the bottom of the truck, and it will probe at a fixed pattern within the truck. That's actually the USDA GIPSA sampling plan, that it will sample. The grain will come up through the probe. It moves like in a vacuum holder and drops down. Over here we're in the test laboratory, and this is the grain is coming down, and there's a riffler in this that will split the grain and make sure that he gets a representative sample, and he's filling canisters that will be retained. He'll do a test from the canister and then retain the canister. So this is the type of laboratory right there in the grain elevator that is used at the beginning of that supply chain. And these are other different areas. This is at the farm. There's an opportunity to test as they load the farm truck, as they move the farm truck. Coming down the river in the barges, these are actually official inspectors. They have the tops of the barges open and they're sampling them with a probe, and he's actually laying the samples out along a deck, and the appropriate tests will be taken there. And then the final one is loading a ship, and again with moving grain, it's an opportunity to sample. It doesn't happen if you're in a port where there aren't those type of sampling opportunities. It may be that the samples come in a bag and you have to sample the bags, and this is what a large export terminal. When it comes to the laboratory, you need to inspect the sample. You need to make sure that what's in the bag, that it has traceability, that what's in the bag is what you expect to see in the bag. They must have traceability, there must be a chain of custody, or else you'll be asked, does this number, did this really come from that ship, or did it come from another ship? Maybe you mix the samples up on the way from the port to your laboratory. And they must have a recorded system, particularly in laboratories that have high throughput, where it's very easy to get them mixed. Need to know how much sample you've received, what else is in there. And this is where we come to the importing country, which will test for the quality, relevant food safety laws. I talked before about Codex being an important overarching organization. The representatives of Codex are governments. There's about 180 governments part of the Codex organization. Codex is a combined organization under the umbrella of FAO and WHO. Other representatives at Codex are scientific organizations, and there are many interactions at the lower levels. I mentioned that Codex is working on a standard for quinoa. The US government is one of the representatives on the working group, and they have come to AACC to ask for advice, and I have in turn gone to people within our organization who have experience working with quinoa, so that all perspectives are brought into play in the things. I mentioned before that different countries have different ways of grading their grain. This is just an example of the classes that occur in Australia. Australian hard, premium white, standard white, premium durum, long list. And then you will find as you get down that there will be some of those lower classes which usually don't go into export. They'll often be used locally for feed and this type of thing. Every country has their own system. In North America, in the US, they have a system that relates to the regions at which they grow the grain. In Canada, it's a system closer to this one, but it's different. So when we're handling grain or export or import, all of the elements that we were talking about in the last presentation come into play. We certainly need some type of process that covers GLP, and we need to maintain performance. We mentioned proficiency, check samples, standard methods, and also all of these elements are important because this is going to ensure that you're providing data that's appropriate. And so I'm not going to go through this anymore. I'm just going to remind you that some type of good laboratory food practice is important if you're measuring within the system, that you do need to be using methods that are recognized, and particularly in trade. It makes a lot of sense to know that you can quote a method number, that you're using the most recent version of the method, that you are current with the methods that you're working with. And in some countries there are official methods that have been determined by the government. And the official method might be exactly the same as an AACC method. Some countries adopt those methods across and others don't. But essentially, it's probably not a good situation to be using your own local laboratory method. You need to have the credibility of an internationally recognized method. It doesn't mean to say that you can't use a local method, as long as you have validated it and compared it to an international method. So you need to validate it in the matrices that you're working with. Just to give you a bit of an idea about what behind the scenes of one of these, this is our methods program, but AOAC has one and AOCS, and there are others around the world. We essentially run an online program, so people using our methods have access to them as an online. They can, of course, download them and use them, but we also have functionality in our methods so that we might have calculators and videos that come associated with the methods. So if you're running a new method or something, and you can buy our methods either as a subscription or as an individual method, so depending on what you want. But this is not all that different to the methods that other organizations have, although most of the others still hold a thing on. I mentioned check samples, and I think these are really important. If you are looking to compare your laboratory, which one of these is right? The one you took or the one they took? How do we know that you're actually coming up with the same number on the same sample? And a number of organizations have check samples and have an associated proficiency with them. But what I wanted to point out here, this is actually a flour sample. It's a hard wheat flour, and the analytes that the people are measuring are moisture, protein, ash, Foley number, wet gluten index, and gluten index. Not all of the laboratories report all of the analyses. That's entirely up to them. It's the type of thing, and there are many more laboratories reporting. I just put an example in here. This laboratory in the middle here is an outlier for their protein measurement. The top one says 12.65. This one is 11.55. It's exactly the situation that I'm talking about there. They've received a homogeneous flour sample. There's something going on in this laboratory. They're also an outlier for their ash measurement. This time they're above the others. They're an outlier for their Foley number, which is actually not a good thing because that'll definitely get a discount. They're at 266. People wanting bread wheat need a 300 and above. So that would definitely be a discount situation. And in fact, you generally get a basic statistics. So in the moisture, let's look at the protein one. The mean of the protein is actually 12.79. So each of these is actually below the mean. And there were 40 laboratories reported here. There must be 52 laboratories, maybe 55 in the series. So that's 55 different laboratories in different locations in different countries who are reporting on the same homogeneous sample. So this is a way you can compare how your laboratory is performing with respect to other laboratories. And it's this type of thing that is very important when you're in a trade situation. You need to know if every time you get a sample, you're below. And so it's important that when you get the results of this analysis, that you actually do a root cause analysis if you're below. You need to find out why it is you're below. Maybe your instrument is calibrated incorrectly. Maybe the analyst who does it doesn't leave the time period long enough. There could be any number of reasons. And it is important to work around it. And it also, because it's a regular, it's an ongoing thing. You can actually see if an instrument is trending because you're starting to fall away. And then we do provide a proficiency thing. And most check sample programs, AOAC has one, AOCS has one. There are programs in Europe. Some of the ones in Europe tend to be programs that you subscribe to 1 or 2 samples. You don't subscribe over a period of time. Whereas the ones that seem to come out of North America, I know that in Australia, the wheat breeders have a program just between the analysts that work for them. So they could be localized programs. You could set one up between your laboratories. Someone has to prepare the homogeneous sample and ship it around. Someone has to do the statistics afterwards. But it is important that if you're trying to keep yourselves in the same, getting the same or as close as possible to the same numbers, that you consider something like this. So the results are reviewed. What you do with those results is entirely up to you. The providers of the check sample series don't tell you you're right or wrong. They tell you where you stand with respect to other laboratories. And then, as I said, you can use this information for product resolution. So coming back, we're looking at a set of specifications that the sellers and buyers agree to. It's usually a mixture of physical and chemical parameters. Methods of analysis, they may define your method of analysis. They may tell you which method they want you to use. They may not. They may leave it up to the testing laboratory, but they do expect that standards are used to facilitate equitable trade. It is important to the traders that there isn't a break in the system. They don't want to be in a dispute resolution. They want to keep, there's so much money tied up in the question. So I guess that brings me back to my first set of questions. Which ones are correct? Are they both or all of them correct? How will you explain the differences? Is your laboratory providing the right answer? Why are you different to the results that the seller is claiming? And can you explain the cause of the differences? It may be, let's just say in this example that one of the results is out here. And this is the buying end, and you've got results like this. But the buyer wants this wheat. The buyer wants this bulk load. They've got a mill to run, they want the wheat to go. So they will have a discussion with the seller. What they want, they say that they'll be able to use it. They can blend it with other grain that will give them a slightly higher number. If the protein level is low, they'll blend it with a higher one, and they'll have a discount. They'll take it, but at a discount. And so it's very important then that they know that they're really dealing with quality values. If they're negotiating discounts, and in fact that's what happens frequently with the Black Sea wheat, that it is dirty, it does need cleaning, they're selling at a discount. They're getting it out of there, they're making the sales, they're taking sales from other exporters, and they're bringing them back there. Now, I've put this slide up here again, you saw it before, and I've remembered to say to you that one of the things that I had meant to say earlier, we've talked about root cause analysis, about proficiency, and those type of things. 12 months ago, the AACC technical committee that's responsible for our check sample program held a one-day workshop. And the presentations essentially took us through the stages and the steps that you need to do as you look at the data, what do you do with the results that you get back from this check sample program? What do you do with the proficiency data? And each of the speakers took on a different topic. We have recorded those presentations, and I think it's going to be early February. We're going to have some live webinars that will actually discuss the overall topic. And when we do those live webinars, we will make available to the people that sign up all of those other presentations that they will come. So they cover, for example, there's a whole presentation on root cause analysis, how to go through the process, the best way to go through it. Usually our webinars are at 10 o'clock in the morning in North America, which would make it about 10 o'clock at night here. So they're probably not something that you would want to watch live, but we do make them available as on demand after we've had the live session. So you might want to go to the website and just have a look. I'm not sure that we've actually started promoting it yet, but early in the new year, if you're interested in having access to something like this, it would be something that once you had access, you could have continuous access, you could share it with people and whatever, but it will be focused on that area. And the reason we did this is that we had found it difficult to find other training programs that actually went in depth on what to do. You get all this data. ISO 17025 tells you to do these analyses, but what does that actually mean, and what should be considered and what shouldn't be considered or what could be considered and what doesn't need to be considered in your laboratory. So I just wanted to remember to say that was something I meant to say this morning. So that is all I've got, unless people have questions. And again, I'll be around for the rest of today. I won't be here tomorrow, so you need to catch me today if you've got a specific question.
Thank you, Dr. Ann, for the presentation on analytical challenges for international trade. So if you have any specific questions?
Ma'am, I just need to ask, what is the basis for the sampling of different samples? Is there any criteria for different root samples sampling?
Yes, there is, but you need to determine what those criteria should be. So if you're sampling a bulk sample, like a ship or a truck or let's say it's a truck of cauliflower or a truck of bringle or something like that, then you will need to take into consideration how easy it will be to sample. And obviously, you probably don't want 100 cauliflowers in your laboratory. It's a little bit of grinding work to do. It may be that you decide that only once a week you will take a sample. They're coming from the same region, the same farm, you know extra information. So for things like fresh fruit and vegetables, there might be a different sampling plan. Actually, that is something that the FDA in the US has been working on. It is a sampling plan for leafy greens. With the increase in interest in organic vegetables in North America, it is now the largest source of food safety risk. It's one of the challenges, and they realized that they actually, while we had sampling plans for grain and seeds and all of these things, there really wasn't one for leafy vegetables, and they've been working on that. And I think that sometime in the near future we'll start to see some of those sampling plans. The USDA gypsum, the green ones, are publicly available. You just follow the things. If you're in a supermarket and you're taking boxes off the shelf, again, it may be that you go once a week, you go once every 6 months. Maybe you're just checking the nutrition labels, or since you talked about shelf life, maybe you're just seeing if a particular food supply line has got a reasonable shelf life on it. It's very dependent and yet at the same time, it needs to be practical. It could be that you've only got a certain limited funds to do the testing. An example of this is a few years ago there was an issue with the rice crop in North America, and it was an issue that was spotted by a regulatory agency in France. And when they queried the supplier said, no, there's nothing wrong with it. And they kept shipping. And it turned out, subsequently, that there was actually something that was in that rice that had not been deregulated, so it was illegal in the rice crop. And rice was sent back to North America, and carry a long story short. But then they cleaned up the problem, and a number of countries that were importing from North America put extra criteria on the rice shipments that were coming. And even though the supplier was now being overseen by the government, and they were being watched as to what they were doing, one of the countries that put extra criteria was the Philippines. And they actually sent an inspector from the Philippines to the US to watch the rice ship be loaded. The rice was in bags, and it was loaded in that port in New Orleans that I showed the picture of. And the same ship was met when it reached the Philippines. And every bag that had been sampled in the US was sampled again. And the samples went to the laboratory, and they were all tested. And it was for a GM a BT, so it's the same trait that's in the cotton crops here. It's BT, it's very easy to pick up with a protein test, a little lateral flow strip. They spent, and everything was tested, and everything was negative, every single test, both on the US side and the Philippines side. But the lab in the Philippines spent their whole annual analytical budget. So all of their plans for the year, all of the things that were much more important, but this was a political situation. So obviously a really unreasonable testing regime. So I think, step back, that's the extreme to the situation. There is a reasonable level and a reasonable level of risk that you can accept with knowing. How important is it for you to know that 1 in 100 packets will be stale next month? Is it a food safety thing, or is it a preference type of thing? So I think we can't take all the food off the shelves and leave nothing for people to eat. So I think it becomes you do the best you can do with a plan, but once you have a plan, you follow the plan. And I think that's the important thing. The things that we hear, that people put plans in place, it requires a sample. There are 5 buckets in the sample. The 5 buckets are too heavy to carry to the truck to bring to the lab, so only 1 bucket comes to the lab. So immediately the protocol falls down. So maybe 5 is too many. Maybe there should have only been 1 bucket in the first place in the protocol. And then you have a reliable protocol. But if the same thing falls down, it doesn't matter how good your laboratory test is. All of the error is going to come from the same thing. So it goes back to my discussion about the seed testing in Brazil, where there were 3 tests and they got a positive with the first one, and then why would they do 2 and 3? But the protocol called for 2 tests out of 3 to be positive. It was a very simple thing, and the problem was that no one had really explained why that this was a false result, and that they were getting false positives from the result. So that was an interesting training session. We had about 100 people in the room, and by the end of the training session, everyone in the room had run these tests. And we watched as the regular inspectors watched their managers grinding seeds and doing the tests. And you can see, your management needs to understand what's involved in the process. Does that help? Yeah. Does anyone else have? Yes?
Non-something samples from the after import. After import, the non-comprehensive samples, who's the responsibility to destroy the samples? After import,
After you've imported them and you've tested them,
yes, it is a non-comprehensive.
and they fail, they're non-compliant.
Non-compliant.
So is anyone, is there
It
an,
is not conforms to standard samples.
sorry? They're,
Not conforms to standards. The samples.
so they don't meet the standards. What is the responsibility to maintain the samples?
Destroy the sample.
To destroy the samples? That is totally dependent on your government regulations. I would think that normally there'd be an expectation that you would keep the samples, you would keep a retained sample until the dispute was resolved. If it's non-compliant, then there will possibly be a discussion. I suppose if I think back to those fish samples sent to Japan, it would depend on how badly they smelt, I guess, as to how long you want to keep them. But you would freeze them, and then they would be available for testing in a dispute resolution. It may be that the whole load is now non-compliant anyway, and for other reasons. But with a grain sample, and as long as you don't have large quantities of them, that you may have a protocol that says I keep them for 3 months, or I keep them for 1 week, depending on what happens to the product. If the product is non-compliant but still accepted by the buyer, let's just say it's flour and it's riding a little low in protein, or maybe it's riding a little high in deoxynivalenol. And the miller says, that's okay, I've got some clean grain in my elevator, I'll blend the two. The level will now be below these recommended levels. And you know that the flour has gone through the system and it will be out into commerce in 3 months or 6 months, and that would be a reasonable time to, but you could end up with a lot of samples if you have. But the obligation is very much local. Does that answer your question?
I have a question regarding these outliers. In one of the tables, you have shown that some values are outliers. So how do you identify those values?
They're done in an iterative process from the total number of samples that are tests that are reported. I think, I'm not exactly sure, but I think it's 2 standard deviations off the mean becomes an outlier, and then a new mean is calculated, and a new set of outliers could be calculated if the mean tightens, and that puts them out. There's some discussion about the best way to do that, and we're working with a system that is 40 years old, and there's been some discussion about whether that's the best way to identify. The new system will be ISO 17025 compliant, so it will have the ISO statistical processes in it, but I'm not familiar with it exactly. I just know that the first outliers from the first set of data, but that once they've taken those ones out, they redo the statistics to identify any further ones. Some that might be protected, someone's a long distance out, then the other ones that are just a little bit out might be if you really needed to know, I could get a statistician to tell you exactly, but what the statisticians tell me is that there is some discussion around how to calculate outliers. I must admit, when I see them in the check samples, I see all of our check samples before the reports go out. I see the tables and look at them. And in fact, we've got to the stage, because we've had so much turnover within the North American grain handling, milling business, we often see a result that's completely out. And in fact, we have someone actually phone the laboratory and ask them if that's really the number they want to report. And in some cases, they're quite determined. Yes, that's the number. In other cases, they say no, but we realized after we sent it in, and we didn't realize that we should call you and say, can you please update it? If they're still below before our cutoff date, then we do allow that. So we've had some communication, and sometimes that's purely that the person who's run the analysis and entered the results hasn't had good training, has really not understood. They've been put into a situation, they've been told to send the results. You know, the boss walks through the lab and says, have you sent those results, and walks out again. And the person does the best they can. And there have been some situations like that. Sometimes people just get the decimal point in the wrong place or put the wrong number in the wrong slot. And we don't have protection around our data entry that stops them doing that, although our new system will. We'll be putting some ranges so that they can't make really silly mistakes, but that does happen. Okay. As I said, I'll be around, and you can have any other questions, and please don't hesitate to ask.
Thank you.